Great. Thank you so much for having me. Let me start my screen share while I wish you a good morning from very sunny Rwanda. I think our weather here is quite different than yours in Finland.
Great. Screen sharing works, and just to let you know, I'll give you a sign or quickly interrupt you at about 10 minutes so that you know that you have 2 minutes left, okay?
Sure, great. So my screen sharing looks okay.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much. So I have 2 lines of research here in Rwanda. Both have to do with gender and forced displacement. So my unrelated line of research is on gender, forced displacement, and environmental conflict. But the line of research that I've actually had longer is on gender and forced displacement within the international refugee system. So today I'll obviously present on the latter. And I have a few articles and a book chapter published on the issue of transgender rights in Pakistan. So this is a case study. This is case study research that I have been doing over the last 18 months or so, based on one asylum seeker in Europe and his family left behind in the Punjab. So this is really focused with the idea of looking at the interactions between the asylum seeker and his family across space and time. So my presentation is really about vulnerabilities and then how people react to those vulnerabilities in different contexts. So for the first 5 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a very quick background on the issue of transgender rights in Pakistan, because it's really fascinating and really unique. And then with that context, I'll go into my book chapter and the case study that I'm working on. So in general, across the world, UNHCR estimates that one transgender person is killed every 2 days, and that was their estimate from 2008 to 2014. And there are certainly cases of violence against transgender populations in Pakistan. But what's really fascinating about Pakistan is that the domestic and international laws there around transgender protections are very contradictory. And Pakistani law has a very, what I call, a schizophrenic view of transgender experiences. And I say this because, on one hand, transgender people face extreme discrimination and marginalization in their everyday life. But on the other hand, Pakistan, quite surprisingly to some people, actually has some of the most progressive transgender rights on paper in the world. So that's what I'll get into a little bit more. Oh, here we go. So here's where this schizophrenia or this paradox comes in. So my previous book chapter, I had detailed the discrimination that transgender Pakistanis experience in the family, in seeking employment, in housing access, in educational opportunities, and in healthcare, and the way that these forms of discrimination and violence really are mutually constitutive and really feed into each other to create this exponentially greater vulnerability. And then I also, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but in case you moved the slide, we can't see the second slide or the next slide if you change slides in between.
Oh, so let's try this. Okay. Let's try this. I know how to fix this. So, okay, how's that? Does that allow you to see previous and coming slides?
Yes, to some extent. We still see the first slide, but maybe it's now moving when you click on the button.
Okay, now do you see the second slide?
No.
That's...
on the first.
On my end, it shows... And okay, so you're still seeing the title slide is what you're saying?
Yes, yeah.
Well, let's try a different share.
Luckily, it seems, that we have only 3 papers, so yes, there's some time.
How's that?
Yes, now it's there.
Great. Okay. And
here.
So now do you?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. So I just covered this slide. And so these are the paradoxical legal issues in Pakistan. And I say it's also paradoxical because on one hand, Khwaja Sira is the term for transgender Pakistanis. They have had special historical roles as royal servants and as political advisors to Mughal rulers before the arrival of the British. And then it's also Khwaja Siras are invited to dance at weddings and at baby naming ceremonies. So they're invited as entertainers at these like very intimate moments in Pakistani family narratives. But then on the other hand, they're also treated very badly. And a lot of this schizophrenia is because in large-scale surveys across Pakistan, it was a common confusion about the difference between biological standing and then sexual orientation and gender identity. And the average Pakistani thought that a transgender person had biologically male and female parts. And so that was where a lot of the confusion was around, was whether it was a biological or a social category. So surprisingly, on the books, Pakistan has some of the best transgender protection laws in the world. They have a third gender category, a transgender category on legal documents, voting documents, driver's licenses, national IDs. In 2009, several judges across the country decided that transgender people who were listed on identity documents as transgender could run for public office, and they have. And then the federal government has also given ample funding to transgender protection organizations within the country. So you seem to have a really large gap between law on the books and funding at the top, and then realities on the ground. So, however, these legal protections in Pakistan are very limited because the law is based on biology-based definitions of what makes for a sexual and gender minority. There's ongoing debate about what Islamic law and Sharia says about transgender people or people of mixed biology. The average Pakistani just doesn't want to go to court to try to fight for their rights. So courts are not seen as a viable way to improve transgender protections. So in general, on the ground, before the refugee leaves, Pakistan represents great codified legal progress, but this far outpaces social and cultural views of transgender rights in everyday life. So when the transgender Pakistanis that I have interviewed and studied arrive in Europe seeking asylum, they find that there is, they don't have any evidence that they were ever persecuted back in Pakistan because they couldn't seek out legal protections. There's an ongoing, they've all reported an ongoing problem with asylum assessors feeling like, well, if you need to dress in a way of a different gender, that's something you can do at home privately. So you don't need to make your SOGI, your sexual orientation and gender identity, a public matter. You can hide that, essentially, has been what my respondents told me that they were told. And in general, in a lot of research on queer refugees, we find that the European asylum questions and timeline are totally incompatible with the reality of being queer in a lot of Islamic contexts, including Pakistan. So many of the transgender queer asylum seekers who arrive to Europe have never, for example, had a same-sex sexual experience, and they've never dated somebody of the same sex because they never had the social space to do so. So the asylum seekers are asking them about their sexual history, and they're essentially saying, I don't have a sexual history, which therefore on the asylum assessor's paper shows a lack of persecution or a lack of standing with that SOGI marginalization. So also a very common problem in all of the transgender research participants I've talked to is that they've been housed with other Pakistanis, other Afghanis, other Indians, or other Middle Easterners, people from their home country. And then, of course, what happens if you're transgender is the same social dynamics that marginalized and created forms of violence for you in your home country are then replicated in your temporary housing in Europe. And sometimes even to a worse degree because you have nowhere to go. So the last challenge for my interview participants is that because Pakistan looks protective of transgender people on paper because they have the laws, then it's difficult for asylum assessors who are unfamiliar with the Pakistani milieu to understand the gap in the law versus what's actually happening on the ground. So in my particular case study, I look at one transgender youth, I'm calling him Hassan, who left when he was 17, and he aged in the system in Thessaloniki, Greece, where he's at a youth housing complex. And he was sent from rural Punjab by his family. And my driving research question was, how do queer refugees and the families they leave behind navigate their vulnerabilities and consequent strategic responses? And I draw on the theory of transnational intersectionality, which most people have identified that traditional intersectionality is really good for domestic analyses, but when we're looking at nationalism across borders, we need to take the transnational into account. And I brought together really three bodies of research in my literature review, that on youth refugees, that on queer refugees, and that on Muslim immigrants in Europe. And so what we identified for the vulnerabilities for Hassan were physical violence, mostly from his peers, and then very limited future employment. And this is where his vulnerability intersects with his family's vulnerability. So in their rural community, they are a family of farmers. It is extremely difficult to meet your basic needs if you do not have stable economic relationships with other community members. And his father and mother reported that because of Hassan Sogi, they were left out of local loan sharing schemes, local savings schemes, and other community level wealth accumulation setups, and that people didn't want to offer his father jobs like for the day because of Hassan Sogi, and the family felt that they were suffering economically because of Hassan Sogi. And then he had 3 siblings, and the family felt that because of Hassan Sogi and social marginalization, that no one would want to marry his siblings. And so in his cultural milieu, getting married, he felt was almost non-optional, because that's how you ensure wealth stays within your family. It's how you ensure that your parents are taken care of in their old age. And then you must have children to take care of you in your old age. So he felt that without anyone to marry, he and his siblings, that they would have a very, very bleak future if he stayed. So he was sent away to Europe 18 months ago and landed in Greece. But before that, there was really 3 vulnerability responses. For about 2 years, his family hid him at home during his primary school years because he had difficulty not gender demonstrating in public. And then after that, he spent 2 years at a madrasa where he memorized the Quran, and the family felt that by asserting religiosity, that would gain him social acceptance. When that didn't work, they finally sent him away. And now he said, now that he's in Greece, and by the way, he asked me to please use the pronoun he. So he's still deciding on his pronouns, but he asked for the pronoun he, even though he identifies as female outwardly. And he now lives as a Kawajasira in Greece. So the main takeaway.
Okay, you have 2 minutes left. Right?
Oh, perfect. I'm on my last slide. Perfect.
Great.
So the main takeaways from the case study are that vulnerabilities and strategic responses of forced migrants and their families are shifting, temporal, and environmentally contingent. And this is especially true when those forced migrants inhabit multiple fluid gender, religious, and national identities over time and across space. So an example of this would be Hassan, identified as gay when he was in Pakistan, but once he arrived to Europe and started seeing a counselor and was exposed to a gender spectrum, he then chose to identify as transgender, which he does today. And moreover, identifying as a gender minority often pits the individual human right of self-expression, which is Hassan's need to live his sogi, with his family's collective need for socioeconomic acceptance within their home community. So his family essentially felt they had to choose between his sogi and their own economic well-being with their neighbors and in their community. So those are the main takeaways, and I think that about covers it if anyone has any questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Laine, for your presentation. That was fascinating overview of your
No, that's okay. I should have about another, I think, 45 minutes or so. How does that? Great. Wonderful.
For overcoming the technical problems so quickly.